Greetings and salutations, young true believers. So today we are talking about G.A. Cohen's The Structure of Proletarian Unfreedom. So first off, we should define some terms. Proletarian is a Marxist term. Marxist referring to Karl Marx, the German philosopher and economist, who obviously wrote such books as the Communist Manifesto and Capital in the 19th century, along with his collaborator Friedrich Engels, right? So a proletarian, gang, is Marx's term for a worker, and specifically an industrial worker as opposed to, say, a peasant, right? Marx thought that the proletarian was in a unique position to understand the oppressive force of capitalism as it was manifested in, well, some would say it's still manifested. I would certainly say that. But certainly specifically in the 19th century, right? In contrast to a proletarian, a worker who has to, again, a proletarian, a worker who has to sell, in Marx's conception, his or her labor power, there's the bourgeoisie, right? And the bourgeoisie are those who control the means of production. They're the capitalist class, right? So Cohen, he expressly wants to challenge a couple of conceptions about this, right? He, as he tells us, this is page 561. He wants to challenge a right-wing answer to the notion that, workers have no choice but to sell their labor, right? But he also critiques some left-wing responses to that right-wing response, right? So what's the summation here? Well, Cohen thinks it's false that the worker has no alternative but to sell his or her labor, right? And not because, as he points out, right, there's some people on the right wing have flippantly always said, well, look, you can just starve, right? Just because someone can do something awful doesn't mean that they're, that's necessarily freedom, right? So he's got some points here to make on 565. It is possible for the proletarian to escape their situation, but it is not easy, and often people do not attempt what is possible but hard, right? That's something that Marx himself talked about. He called it the dull malaise of economic situations, right? You just get used to the situation you're in, and it doesn't occur to you that you have the power to change it if you really work hard, right? Two, there's also again, this is exactly what we're talking about. What Marx called the dull compulsion of economic relations. Long occupancy, for example, from birth of a subordinate class position nurtures the illusion, as important for the stability of the capitalist system as the myth of easy escape, that one's class position is natural and inescapable. And three, finally, there's the fact that not all workers would like to be petty or trans-petty bourgeois. A trans-petty bourgeois would be like a small business owner as opposed to someone like Jeff Bezos, right? And he cites Eugene Debs, who was an anarchist, a socialist, right? He said, quote, "I do not want to rise above the working class. I want to rise with them," right? So that's kind of, again, while Cohen has critiques to make of Marx's claim that there's, all that the worker can do is sell his or her labor power, there are alternatives. You can rise above and become a petty bourgeois, but it isn't easy, and most people don't, right? And moreover, the right-wing critique fails to take into account the extent to which people have class consciousness, right? Now, not every single proletarian has class consciousness. Some would be happy to leave their lot, and win the lottery and just never have to worry about looking at poor people again. But many poor people would like to take lift the rest of the poor people out of poverty, right? And so that leads him to these considerations on page 567. Collective unfreedom can be defined as follows. A group suffers collective unfreedom with respect to a type of action A, if and only if performance of A by all members of the group is impossible. Collective unfreedom comes in varying amounts, and it is greater the smaller the ratio of the maximum that could perform A to the total number in the group. Collective unfreedom is particularly interesting when, as in our example, there is more freedom for a set of individuals taken individually than for the same individuals when they are taken as members of a group. Collective unfreedom, we might say, is irreducibly collective when more can perform a in sensu diviso than can perform it in sensu composito. And collective unfreedom matters more the smaller the ratio mentioned above is, and the more important desirable action A is, right? So, despite the fact that, yes, we see instances of there being an American dream whereby people rise out of poverty and attain to a higher standard of living, that's often not the case. And that's exactly what he's talking about, Key being Cohen again, when he talks about this collective unfreedom, right? It is a real extant situation. So to sum everything up here on page 574, with respect to societies, Cohen writes, what is nearly true, though false, may be more important than what is strictly true, since what is strictly true may be only barely true. When considering such theses as that workers are individually free to escape the proletariat, we should be aware of arguments which would at best show them to be barely true.